variability also means that potentially we can find ways to improve on our own performance, right? And so if my performance is variable, we can better understand why at some point in time I'm not doing so well. And if we're able to better identify why that's the case, then potentially we could make sure that my performance is sustained at a higher level over time, and then why not maybe enhanced if I can to a level that was unknown before, but so that I can perform better, right? And so there are different ways to do that, and of course we all know that in very drastic cases there are some surgeries that can improve our cognitive performance. There's a range of pharmaceutical interventions with drugs that can help us perform better. But what I'm going to be talking about today mostly is about non-invasive interventions. And one very good advantage of those interventions is that there's very little side effects, and that potentially actually the side effects of a bunch of the interventions that I'll be talking about are actually beneficial, right? So we can think of, for example, physical exercise, where on top of maybe some form of cognitive enhancement, we'll also say becoming healthier, right? So that will be the focus of my talk for today. And so I'm just giving like a range of behavioral interventions that fit the definition of those that I'll be covering today. So brain training, if we think of like computerized brain training is one example. Sometimes it's in the form of video game training, so that would fit in there as well. Physical exercise as well. I know that part of the crowd, at the very least here, is aware with some of that work. Some people have looked at meditation. Some people have looked at non-invasive TDCS as well. And there are many more, right? And so my point is not to try and cover each and every one of those here. My point is just to give an overview of what that can be, what I'm referring to, and then most of the remainder of my talk will just hopefully be relevant irrespective of what you're interested in. So you might be interested, like very interested in physical exercise, and that's what your research is about. And I'm hoping that what I'll be talking about will be relevant to you. But if you actually are really here for this talk because you care about TDCS and measuring cognitive enhancement in that way, I'm hoping that what I'll be covering will actually also be relevant, right? And so in the talk, I'm talking about three main challenges, right? Well, I'm talking about challenges in general, and here I've sort of I've broken them down into like three main components. One of that component will be conceptual challenges. We'll see what I mean by that exactly, because it's a little bit fuzzy at this point. I'll talk about methodological challenges as well. So about, say, things like how we measure things, right? So we're like, what are the challenges that come with measuring things, measuring change, for example. And then I'll talk about epistemological challenges, which I think are a little bit more, maybe less clearly defined, and is kind of where my thinking is going right now recently. But I think there's also something there that potentially could be of interest to this group, I hope. And so I want to start with the conceptual challenges, and I'm going to give you an overview that I think everybody's aware of here. So we all know that, in psychology, in the social sciences, in the biological sciences, the medical sciences, there's been a lack of replicability in the last, decade, couple decades maybe. So that's a real challenge when we're trying to use some form of intervention to enhance cognitive performance, because if things don't replicate from one research group somewhere in the world to another, then potentially we don't really know what to believe, right? And so a bunch of challenges that came with this is the number of degrees of freedom that we have in how we run an experiment, how we analyze our results, how we do a whole bunch of things that can actually change the outcome, right? So if you take the example of an intervention study, irrespective of what the intervention is about, it could be TDCS, physical exercise, brain training, meditation, mindfulness, it could be anything you think of. there's a lot of flexibility in what you can actually incorporate in your intervention, right? So not only do we have flexibility in what we can put there as a training regimen, right? So, brain training, physical exercise, and so on and so forth. But there are also very different ways to, say, measure outcomes, right? We could potentially have lots of those outcome measures. We can be interested in, I don't know, things like, working memory, attention, we could be looking at academic performance as an outcome measure. There are various things there that we can really tap into when we're looking at outcome measures, and this needs to be defined prior to starting the experiment, so that we don't end up with a gigantic mess of things that we could look at. And there are many more here, so I'm not trying to list them all. I'm just trying to make the point that there are challenges in how we're designing those interventions. And one point that I think illustrates this quite well is that there are challenges even in the type of studies that you think wouldn't have those kinds of challenges. So what I have here is a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis that's looking at cognitive training, and the initial conclusion from that meta-analysis by our colleagues there was that short-term cognitive training can result in beneficial effects in important cognitive functions, right? So a pretty big statement there. So we're saying that based on those 20 studies, that's a meta-analysis. Based on those 20 studies, what those authors were saying is that, we think that there is something there, right? There's important cognitive improvements as a result of short-term cognitive training. Now, based on the same data set, so we're talking about a meta-analysis. Some authors, Melby-Lervac and Hume there, they took this same data set and they reanalyzed that. And realizing this, they concluded there was no convincing evidence that working memory training is effective, right? So they're taking the same studies, the same 20 studies, and they're running their own analysis, and they're concluding that it does not seem to be working, right? And then the original authors replied to that claim and said there is no convincing evidence that working memory training is not effective, right? So you kind of like see the whole chain of event there. People looking at the same data and sort of extracting apparently some very different conclusion from it, right? And the reason why I'm saying it's everywhere is that we're not even talking here about, you running something in your lab and I'm running something in my lab and we're not finding the same thing. We're talking about people looking at a meta-analysis and looking at the studies that are compiled within that meta-analysis and saying, yep, there's something, no, there's nothing, yeah, I think there's no evidence that there's nothing, right? So those are the three claims together. And so it really shows us that, there's a lot to those kind of training interventions. There are things potentially people are bringing in their own, biases and knowledge as well, right? To read the results and interpret them. And, so potentially there's something there that needs to be addressed because at the end of the day, we kind of need to be able to extract some kind of knowledge from something like a meta-analysis like that. And so one thing that I've sort of mentioned in a recent paper is that, and that's by no means, I'm not the first one to say that at all, but I think we kind of need to differentiate what do we mean by improvement. And of course, most, if not all people here in this crowd will know that, it's kind of like, it's obvious that we need to define what kind of improvements we're expecting and what are the sort of limits of those improvements. But here we have an example of those three layers in that graph where I'm talking about the training regimen, so the intervention itself, and then, what we think the gains will be, the improvements themselves, that's the middle layer, and then whether or not there's strong or weak empirical evidence for it, so the strength of that evidence at the bottom, right? And basically, you can relate things that are at the top to things that are at the bottom. And here we have an example in that graph of, say, a single task. So if you just train with a single task, like say, the NBAC working memory task, right? And that's all you do. And for those who are not familiar with this form of brain training, it's actually a very common one where there's a lot of literature that's been published on this. So basically, the idea would be that you train on the NBAC task, and then people are making some claims about what improvements you get. And depending on what the claim is, actually, there's very different support. So if you look at whether or not NBAC is going to influence your ability to perform well on that particular task, the NBAC task, then there's really robust evidence, right? So that's the sort of vertical line going, downstream from the top there. If the task is the same and it's measuring the same ability, then there's usually robust evidence for people improving. In other words, if you practice something, you get better at it, right? That makes a lot of sense. Now, if you're looking at single task and trying to relate that to, so if you're looking at the NBAC all the way at the top and trying to relate that to a different task, but that's measuring the same ability, something like the complex span task, which is also a working memory task, then there seems to be evidence that's fairly conclusive that, you can improve working memory pretty much by training on the NBAC task. But it gets a little bit more fuzzy when you're looking at, some form of transfer or generalization to other abilities. So say if you want to see whether or not, a single task, we're still at the bottom left, right? If this is going to lead to improvements in a different task and a different ability, like the Raven's matrices, which is a measure of, fluid cognition or fluid intelligence, then the evidence is pretty limited, right? There's some early results that seem to suggest this and has failed to be replicated. So people are not really confident that this is the case at this point. And if you're looking at whether or not, like something like the NBAC is going to help you with, real world applications, things like academic assessments or your, professional work, things like that, there's anecdotal evidence, which is short for saying, there's really not any kind of robust anything that warrants our attention at this point. So the whole point here is to say, well, say that say TDCS or brain training or physical exercise is going to lead to improvements. We also need to sort of specify what we mean by improvement, right? If we mean improvement that are things that would be thought of as being, say, near transfer or far transfer, or things that were trained in the first place, all those things, they might seem like details, but it actually does matter because the evidence is very different from one to another. Another thing that we've kind of mentioned that's kind of linked to that is also that averages can be misleading. So when you look at you can look at meta-analysis, and that's the kind of graph that we have right here. That's basically fitting a mixture model to a distribution of effect sizes. If you look at meta-analyses that are all supposedly looking at the same thing, oftentimes you see that they're not going to actually be all coming from the same latent distribution, right? So in other words, there seems to be some variation there that we need to take into account, and this is true at the level of meta-analysis, but it could also be done at the level of your one study, looking at each individual, right? So there are individual differences, and those individual differences can be actual individuals, or it can be individual studies. And those, if you look at graph C here, the problem is that if you average, which is the little blue dot at the top, you might actually be mixing apples and oranges, right? So if the true underlying effect is what we have in that figure B, right, which is that we have two curves, two modes, and that we're concluding that the average is, somewhere in the middle, then potentially, yes, on average, we're right, it is somewhere in the middle, but it could be the case that, no single studies or no single individuals is ever in the middle, right? So that people, if we're thinking about training studies or behavioral interventions, you can think of this as, imagine if you have if you're doing a TDCS intervention and, it doesn't work for most people, and then it works really, really, really well for a few of those people, right? If you kind of take the average, and those are just the two options, right? If you take the average, you'd say, well, TDCS seems to have a small effect. And of course, we understand with that sort of like crazy extreme example that I just took that, yeah, sure, it's true that on average there's some like a small effect, but it doesn't tell us much in terms of what we could actually do with our intervention, what we could implement as a result. Because really, what we would need to do with an intervention like that is identify why is it that it doesn't work for most and it really works well for those. Identify what's very specific to those individuals that seem to respond well to that intervention, and then better understand this and better understand how we might want to sort of personalize our intervention so that it works for more people, right? And so this is also something that I've looked at for things like brain training, video game, and then other types of interventions that are here, mindset interventions, stereotype threat interventions. And there seems to be evidence across all those brief intervention domains to suggest that oftentimes, if you look at meta-analyses, they are actually conflating apples and oranges, right? It seems to be the case that a lot of those analyses actually, a lot of those studies, they are in support of a null effect. And then a few of those are, a few of the studies that are included have an extreme effect, and that people run a meta-analysis and on average they conclude that, those things have a small effect on our, cognition. And I think it's misleading because most of the time it doesn't work. Sometimes it works a lot. And so we need to identify, are those false positives? What's going on in those labs that are finding those results? Are they doing something different that we should know about so that we can implement better interventions? This is actually important. And so the point of that study that I'm showing here on screen was to say, well, we can identify that there are things there that should be further explained. We should further dig into those differences. And so there's something there, there's something that's probably of interest, and we should look into this, right? And then of course, the time frames also vary across studies and paradigms, and that's something that's, that makes things a little bit more complicated. And I think I'll give you an example because we know this very well from the physical exercise literature, right? This is based on a meta-analysis that we did a couple of years ago, where we looked at the acute effect of exercise, high intensity exercise on executive functions. And we know that immediately after exercise, if you try and perform a demanding task, you might get a facilitating effect, you might get a debilitating effect, but this has very little to do with how you would feel, say, like a day later, right? So there'll be, if you do just one short session, and then you might see that it helps your performance. If you're tested again the next day without any kind of exercise, you probably won't have any kind of leftover effect, right? So that's the very acute effect. And we also know that there's a more long-term effect. So if you engage in physical exercise regularly, say for a month, 2, 3, 4, maybe 6 months, then you would see that if we test your cognitive function, even if you haven't exercised, you now have changes, structural changes that are going to be beneficial, and they're not just due to the sort of increased alertness that you might get immediately after exercise. They're more like long-term changes, right? So this actually matters because sometimes, not so much anymore, but in previous literature and when people were looking at physical exercise, they were sometimes talking about those two things interchangeably, and that's obviously misleading because we're talking about two different things here that might have some common underlying mechanisms, but they are probably different. And like more related to the project, that we've been talking about here in this group. If you're looking at TDCS, it might be the case that, for example, TDCS might have a facilitating effect immediately after a TDCS session, but that those effects might not last. Or it can also be the case, and of course the two are not mutually exclusive, but it can also be the case that there are no effects immediately after the session, but that over time, if you repeat that stimulation every day for a little while, then over time that might lead to long-term, beneficial effects, right? And so those two things are obviously different, and we understand that they are different, but we also need to potentially look at the mechanisms for each of those sort of time scales to better understand what the intervention is actually doing, right? I forgot to say, but like if there's any kind of question or anything, I'm happy to stop along the way. I won't stop for question unless you're letting me know. So I'll just carry on. But if you have a question that relates to one of the slides, I'm happy to stop at any point. So that's like the first set of challenges that I see in interventions, all those, like the conceptual aspect of it, how we actually, think about change and what we're trying to do in the first place. There are a bunch of challenges that are maybe more down to earth, kind of like how do we measure things and how do we do things. So it's more of a methods kind of aspect of it. And, I kind of enjoy that. I know that for some people, maybe this would be more boring. So I'll see, at what point I kind of like sort of skip to that. But yeah, the idea is that I think that if we're going to try and understand what our interventions are doing, we really need to make sure that our methods are solid and robust, right? And, the first thing that we kind of like, that we're trying to do in my group, and that, we're, of course, again, we are just doing what other people have done, probably better than us before. So this is just one example. But it's, of course, to use multiple tasks per construct, right? So if we're trying to, say, measure cognitive control and working memory, like we did in that experiment, then we're going to use, I think we had like 3 cognitive control tasks and 4 working memory tasks, or the other way around, right? So we're going to use multiple tasks. We all understand why. There are things within those tasks that are, cognitive control or working memory things, but there are also things that are just, I really like numbers, and this working memory task is about numbers. And so there are things like that are going to be, that are going to bias our results. And so ideally, we want to measure, say, working memory in a lot of different ways, multiple ways. So that we can extract some general working memory, score out of that. That is because we don't want to be in a scenario that we explain here, where we're just inflating the task without inflating or without truly improving the ability, right? So let me just unpack this a little bit here. So this is all hypothetical, right? The idea is to understand what could happen in the case of intervention. So we have a baseline measure or testing session at the top, where we have 3 measures, measure 1, 2, and 3. And, some measures are going to be better than others at, sort of giving us a picture, an idea of what the theoretical construct is. So a theoretical construct here could be working memory, for example, and we have 3 measures of it, right? And we have measures of working memory that are really good and some measures that are not as good, but we usually also include those that are, slightly worse than the best ones, because we want to have we want to be able to tap working memory in a broad way, right? Now, it could be the case that, we have 3 different scenarios here post-intervention. We have that scenario where nothing changes, that's scenario number 1, so we don't need to spend too much time on that one. But what's more interesting, I think, is scenario number 2 and 3 here, because they might, it is possible that they will all look like improvements, and I think that they're quite different. So if you look at scenario number 2, we only got an increase in measure 1, right? Quite a big increase in measure 1. Measure 2 and 3, we did not improve on those measures of working memory. And in scenario 3, we improved in all 3 measures of working memory, right? Working memory is just the example I'm giving here, but it could be anything. And the idea here is that potentially we need to make sure that we're able to differentiate those 2 sets of results, because in scenario number 2, it can really be the case that we're just improving one task in particular for whatever reason this is. But this might not actually be a change in working memory. Maybe we just got better at that task. Maybe that task was, I don't know, maybe kind of complex to begin with, and now we got better at this, better at apprehending how to do that particular task. But actually, we don't really have a change in our working memory, a change that would translate to real-world improvements, right? Whereas in scenario number 3, we've got improvements across the board, and so it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a true working memory change, but chances are it's more likely than it is a genuine change, right? Because now all working memory measures improved. That seems to suggest that there's really something going on with our intervention, right? Something went well. And so to be able to do that, we kind of need to define in those interventions what are we trying to actually do, right? So you're going to see interventions out there. There are actually lots of TDCS interventions like that, physical interventions like that as well. They're not going to be looking at, diversity of outcomes. They look at pretty much everything. And, sometimes some of those interventions are going to look at a bunch of things, and then they're going to just, report the significant ones, which obviously is problematic. But we won't even talk about those sort of fallacies or flaws here. But the idea really is that we want to know what is it we're trying to measure and what's the hypothesized effect of our measurements. So maybe we're trying to measure, say, working memory, as we see here with our measures, the narrow construct, that's the blue one here. And we're trying to get many different measures of a slightly narrow construct, which could be working memory. Or maybe we want to have a broad construct, in which case, we're also going to have a bunch of measures. But in this case, maybe the broad construct is just, cognition in general. And we have a working memory measure, a spatial ability measure, a cognitive control measure, and so on and so forth, right? And we're trying to see basically, our brains, working better after the intervention, sort of unrestricted. And so it's kind of important to clearly define this beforehand and pre-register what we're going to find, to not find ourselves in that situation where we have a whole bunch of measures and then afterwards people are thinking, well, yeah, you're reporting this particular result, but you could have reported this or this or this or that. How do we know that you didn't try, 1,000 things? And so the way you can show that is with a pre-registration, right? Show that, well, I've registered that this was what I wanted to do before. This is what I wanted to look at. And what you might think is an odd combination of measure A, B, C, and D as a construct is actually what I pre-registered. And so, there isn't much of trying to find a significant p-value or a large base factor. Really, it's just what I did what I said I would do, right? And the same is true, by the way. I'm just putting this as an example here, but we're saying this a lot for experimental studies. But I started that talk talking about meta-analysis, and the same is true for meta-analysis as well, right? More and more people, including us, are calling for pre-registering meta-analysis so that we know beforehand what is it that you wanted to do, and if you deviate from your original plan, you can explain that and you can justify that, and there's no problem with this. But at least then we know that things were done in a transparent way, and we can trust your results more, right? That's the whole idea. And finally, a little bit more recently, and that might be of interest for those of you who are doing like, more advanced analysis, especially like imaging analysis and things like that. You also want to make sure that people can reproduce your results. And so I won't talk about this in too much detail here, but we have a kind of a tutorial here that is about the use of containers. Just to make sure that your computing environment that you use to run your analyses, that somebody else can take that computing environment and reproduce exactly what you did, right? And if you by using a container, you're just sharing an image of what your computer was like at that point in time, which software you had, which dependencies, which versions of every package that you had, which operating system you were on. And even if someone has a different operating system, different versions of those packages and so on and so forth, they're able to reproduce your results exactly, right? And that's important because if they can reproduce your results, potentially they can extend upon them, and that can sort of facilitate a collaborative science that you wouldn't see if those things break down, right? So it's especially important if using different software, so you're using R and also MATLAB and this and that, and they all call upon each other, and you want to make sure that other people can rerun your analysis and find the same thing. For PIs within labs, it's also important because you can make sure that what you're running now will still run in 5 years, right? For example, in case you have like other students that are picking up that work. So it's very appealing in that way, I think. And so I'm now like moving on to the sort of the third set of challenges that I've seen, and I hope we'll talk about. I hope this is not just a talk about things that we do wrong, because I'm trying to highlight every time how we can oftentimes fairly easily improve on those situations. So it's not meant to be a negative talk. It's just meant to be sort of like down to earth talk, where we're kind of like looking at what works, what doesn't work so well, and trying to find solutions for things that are not too easy to do or that don't work as well. And so in that last part, I'm just going to talk about a number of maybe sort of high level questions that we can look at. And one of them that you've been probably hearing a lot about lately is this idea that like psychology and to some extent neuroscience that doesn't have good theories, that we're kind of like the reason why we're unable to reproduce results is because our theories are not good. And so we're trying to do a little bit of work on that too, and try and see how we can sort of conceptualize this to make sure that we can improve the chance that we have that we find true results, like true discoveries, right? Here we have an example of, the layer 3 is probably what we usually see here. We talk about co-registration, replication, multi-lab studies, and stricter error control. All of those things are in the empirical world, where we're going to have a bunch of, significant findings. Those are the pluses here. We can look at the one in the middle, the two columns that we have in the middle. We've got a number of significant findings, the plus with the plus sign, and a number of non-significant findings with the negative sign. And then, of course, we're not always right. So sometimes we have a significant finding, but the little dot is a pink one, right? Which means that it was a false hypothesis, but we think it's significant, so we conclude that there is something there, even though there is nothing. It does happen sometime, so it's a false positive. And it also does happen that sometimes, over all those non-significant findings, we have, green little dots. So those things that are true hypotheses, but because of a lack of statistical power, we miss them, right? So we've got, there is some version in this work where we're making the wrong call, pretty much, right? And so that scenario in the middle is kind of like where where we are maybe, sometimes with our experiments. But you can see that if you move on to the right and you move to what is equivalent to a theoretical framework where that has perfect predictions, that makes perfect predictions, and you really understand everything that's going on, in your theory, then you're going to extract only true hypotheses. And so all the significant findings that you're going to find, they're all actually, they're all true. And actually, the only error that you're making is that you're missing some of those true findings because of your lack of power, right? And on the other end of that spectrum, if your theory is pretty bad, so you see a theoretical strength at the top, if it's close to zero, then all of your predictions are just going to be false, right? So your theory is really not good at all. It's going to make bad theories. And so in that extreme case, and again, it's a toy example, right, to try to understand what we're trying to do here. But in that extreme case, all our hypotheses are going to be false. And so the only significant findings that we're going to have, they're going to be false positives, right? Okay, so this is like a long story to say that, basically how much theory and how much we're thinking about what we're testing, how much that actually influences our results, right? And we might not think about it this way, but that influences our statistical results. And for a significant result with like a small p-value, for example, it does matter whether or not our experiment is based on sound science, right, with a strong theory as to why we would put that electrode there, if we're talking about a TDCS experiment, or why we would do things for 10 minutes as opposed to half an hour. How much knowledge went into that actually does matter, because it increases the chance that the discovery that we're going to make, the significant findings that we're going to have, it increases the chance that they actually reflect genuine discoveries, right? And so it's very important that way. And that's where, kind of like doing those interventions where, we'll just do something and then we'll throw a whole bunch of measures and see what happens. That's where they're prone to error, as opposed to someone who's, say, for example, studied carefully what TDCS does, what the literature says, and, systematically vary the position of those electrodes, and to get a really good understanding of what's happening, right? So those are very different approaches, and perhaps unsurprisingly, you get very different outcomes from being in one approach or the other. Okay, so that's kind of the idea for the challenges, and so we're about halfway through now. Just kidding, we're not halfway through. Well, I'm pretty much done, but I just have just a few outstanding questions that I think are interesting that potentially can inform, the Q&A session. And then I'll be really happy to hear yours, pretty much. So I think that there are a number of questions that we still, don't really know too much about. And one important one, to me anyway, is the first one, right? What does it mean when performance improve on a task or a set of tasks, right? So we've got lots of interventions out there, a whole bunch of behavioral interventions that are going to show some form of improvement on cognitive tasks. And the good one are going to be, they're going to be looking at improvements on standardized tasks, so well-known, reliable tasks to measure cognition, for example. But what does it really mean when we improve on a task like that, right? Does it actually mean that we've improved on things that, matter in everyday life? Or could it be the case that in some of those cases, we've improved on that task, but it doesn't really translate to, anything out there in everyday life? If we do improve on that task, what does it mean? Like, how come our, stimulating world was not already training that ability? How come that task actually had such an influence on the outcome that we couldn't get from, our regular, work stimulation or studies or anything we're doing that's mentally engaging and stimulating, right? So I think it's kind of like really important to to actually come and struggle a little bit with what it means to enhance performance in that way, especially since those tasks, all the tasks that we're using to measure improvement, they're not designed to measure improvement, right? They're designed, all those tasks, they come from like back in the day, the earliest was probably like early 20th century when Binet started like those IQ tests and everything. And so the whole idea was to be able to sort of rank people, right? To know who's doing well, who's not doing so well. But it was never the case, and all the cognitive tasks that we have, they stem from that kind of from those times. It was never the case that those tasks are designed to measure change over time within an individual. So we're kind of using them in that way, and we're assuming that they're valid in that way. But I think it's an assumption that needs to be tested more specifically. So that's the first one there. And on the more practical side, we can think about how we can actually combine interventions to maximize outcomes, right? How can we combine, physical exercise interventions and say like TDCS, for example? Like, is that a combination that makes sense? How do those effects compare? Can they add up? Are they additive effects or not? So I think this is a more practical way of thinking about things, but and potentially, can we blend those interventions together? So that's also something that I've been doing some work on when I was at in the United States at Princeton University, and finally, basically, if you're working in the space of interventions, I think a very, very important thing that a lot of people are looking at is how can we design interventions that are not just, good on average, and it comes back to what I was saying about, averages being potentially misleading, but are actually the best, for you, if that's what you plan on doing, or for that person who's taking part in that intervention, right? So it might be the case that on average the best is to have some form of cognitive stimulation and to have some form of fitness training and so on and so forth. But it might also be the case that for that one particular person that's coming to your to your study or to you for help, that person is so fit that actually physical exercise is going to do very little for them in terms of cognitive improvements, right? So even though it is true that physical exercise is very important for cognitive improvements, it is not true for that person because they already are very fit and they already are doing what they need to do, and they're pretty much a ceiling, right? So again, that's an extreme example, but just to say that what is true on average for an entire population might not be the best course of action for one person in particular. And so there are more and more of those studies that are trying to look at, assessing people to get a baseline profile of how those people are doing and a whole bunch of things, their mood, their personality, all kinds of things like that, to be able to see, okay, for that person, based on everything we've fed into the model, then the best course of action, the best blend of intervention is, predominantly exercise plus this, plus that, right? So I think that a lot of people are moving towards that space, and I think that's very interesting. And that's me, and I just wanted to thank you guys for attending this talk and listening to me. I'd be really happy to discuss, anything related or anything beyond that further with you guys.
Thank you very much. So,
all right.
It's a great talk. So before I jump into discussion, can I invite everyone to turn on their camera and we can have the group photos? So please. Yes. Now, could you help to take photos for everyone? Is okay? Okay, thank you very much. So I do have some questions about your talk. It's very insightful because, you know, we are also running some experiments using like cognitive intervention training program, and we are also focusing on, you know, TDCS brain stimulation on, you know, subject cognitive performance. But when we do that study, we found there's large individual variation. So some people do have effects and some people do not. And even for some people, they have the adverse effect. So, and also the cognitive measures is very important. For some tasks, we do observe the effect, but for the others, we don't observe any effects. So it's, you know, it's like a big challenge for us to pick up the sensitive measures to measure the cognitive ability. So sometimes we even need some implicit measures, the indirect measures to measure the cognitive changes due to the intervention. So that could be a very, you know, general questions about how to select sensitive measures. But usually the literature will report only the significant results.
Yeah.
For the non-significant results, they don't report. So we never know what is correct and what kind of function we are training and we are focusing. So we do have the same, you know, challenges as you highlighted.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. Ideally, right? Ideally, all those studies would be pre-registered, so you see what they did not report was probably non-significant. You see all the measures that they tested. Ideally, they just report, you know, all their measures, at least in the supplemental materials, so that you can go and check this out, even if that's not the main measure of interest in their particular paper, right? Because yes, it is a bit of a challenge. I know that, for example, in some of the studies that we're doing, we are, you know, looking at like in a longitudinal way in how different forms of intervention are impacting things like working memory and attention, cognitive control. And we also have that issue where we are trying to see, you know, the extent to which those are, you know, the effect of the intervention or retest effects, right? Like training effects. And so there are some tasks out there. We are still experimenting at this point in time, but there are some tasks out there that are supposed to be fairly robust to retest, for example. So things that are very sort of very simple in terms of the cognitive processes that are involved. So things like reaction time tasks, like go no go tasks and things like that are supposed to be, sure, you get better maybe the second time you do it, but then eventually you're pretty much at ceiling because the task is not difficult to do. And once you got it, you perform as well as you can, and then you're limited by sort of like neurophysiological limitations that you have about reaction time, right, that are difficult to train. And so potentially the only thing that's making those tasks fluctuate is how alert you are on that day, right? So if you're fatigued or not, if you've been sick before, if you slept well. And so it's good for us to have as a good index measure of, how people are doing on that day, so we can sort of factor this out of the other task where we're looking for changes. But you're right that it's it's a challenge in the sense that, it's difficult to know exactly why this is happening with some tasks and not others. I think it's good maybe to look at some, if you're looking at things like working memory or attention, for example, to look at the training literature to see not actually transfer, but say when people are training on the NBAC task, how quickly they improve. and how much individual differences there are out there, so that if you're using, say, the n-back task in this case in your experiment, you can better relate that to what would happen, in a training experiment. But it is definitely a challenge, and there's no simple way out of it, right?
Yeah. So do you have any experiences, doing the training with children, small kids, or aging elder adults? Because if we want to do some training, we need to use a very limited time to find the effect. So I'm not sure how to deal with this kind of specific populations.
With kids, yeah, we've done some training interventions with kids. The eLife paper is something that was done with children, 7 to 15 or 14. And so, for those, it's very important to, one very important thing is to be able to make sure that you have a good control group, because obviously those developmental populations, they do improve naturally, right? Those kids, they just get better over time just because they're growing. And so you need to make sure that you can account for this. It's also the case that they're not necessarily able to, dedicate as much time on a battery of tasks as adults could do without getting fatigued. And the problem is that fatigue can actually influence their performance quite a lot. So I would say it's probably a good idea also to have some kind of measure of, even just a self-report questionnaire of how much they're enjoying they've enjoyed the experiment or things like that, so that you're able to see those that are completely bored or did not want to do it in the first place, so that you're able to run analysis without them to see if it kind of changes your results, because it's kind of difficult to not all kids are going to comply, right? And it's kind of it's maybe more difficult to make sure that it's the case than it is with adult populations.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
I have a question. This is Manali. You mentioned about average can be misleading. So in your opinion, you think when we publish papers, is it better to present our data with the average and also the effect size and anything else? And any recommendations? Because I'm heard that you mentioned that average is, probably not always a good choice.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Any recommendations?
Yeah, I think no, that's a really good question, because it's kind of it's easy for me to say averages can be misleading, and then you're right that in practice, okay, what do we do? And that's a harder problem, right? So it's a really good question. I think so. Oftentimes, just starting by so if you're doing an experiment, starting by plotting, the sort of average performance for each individual, and see what you're dealing with is already kind of it's already really helpful, right? So if you look at when I was looking at showing the distribution of effect sizes in those fields that are where averages are misleading, it's because they have two peaks, right? They have two modes, and so potentially there's an issue there, because if we're just taking the average between those two, pretty much, right, they might have a different height, so it might not be the exact midpoint, but it's somewhere in between, then it's unclear what we're actually saying, right? And so if you do an experiment where you have, a lot of people that respond, really well, and a lot of people that, don't respond at all, and again, that you conclude that it's somewhere in between, it's kind of questionable, as opposed to having an experiment where reliably every individual is going to show that average effect, right? So one solution is to kind of like plot performance and see is there evidence for like one bell curve pretty much, or more than that, right? So there are more sophisticated ways as well to analyze this. Mixture modeling is one of them, to try and identify multiple peaks in your distribution. Another way as well is to look at, that's complementary, to look at how many people are going to show the effect in the expected direction, right? So you might see, for example, that you're doing an intervention, and then on average, it's quite different if you have 10% of people that benefit from the intervention, but they benefit from it a lot, or if you have 80% of the people that benefit from your intervention, but on average it's not that big. And then this could be the same average that we're looking at in those two scenarios, right? But in your kind of 10% situation, potentially you kind of need to better understand what's happening with those 10%, because there's a potential for you to really help them a lot, but you kind of need to know that you're dealing with somebody who fits that profile. Whereas with the scenario where you're helping most people, 80% of people, a little bit, then potentially you could implement this kind of intervention at scale without having to worry too much about baseline profiling first, right? So people are looking at things like how many people are going to show the effect, a significant effect in the right direction in this case, and so you can extract a percentage there and see that you've got that many. So it's the case that your intervention is beneficial to all those people. So yeah, different ways to take into account that variability, and at some point, if there's too much variability that's not explained in your experiment, that might also mean that there's something that could be refined with your experimental design. Maybe you're doing some kind of attention task, and some people are coming in the morning after getting coffee, and some people are coming like last thing before they're going home. So maybe you need to restrict your testing time to just do it like consistently, either one or the other, but not have that kind of like mix and match procedure. And of course, what I'm talking about, we wouldn't do, right? Because we know how to run experiment. But I'm thinking about this kind of silly example on purpose, because things are more subtle, but they might look like that sometimes.
Yeah, thank you so much. When you mentioned about the variability, I think if we have if you use a clinical outcome measures, it probably also interesting to use a minimal detectable change, yes, for each person, for individual data.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that can be combined with what I mentioned before, right? So you could look at so you could identify for a clinical intervention, what's the minimal outcome that you think would be, beneficial, right? So I might say that, I'm doing an intervention for depression, and honestly, if I improve things by 0.1%, there are some good interventions out there that are better than mine, and they probably shouldn't be doing mine, right? So I can try and gauge, at what threshold would I say, hey, those people, they really did benefit from my intervention, and then see how many people in my sample will reach that threshold, right? Which I think that is what you're referring to. Did I get this right?
Yes.
Yeah. That's a really good approach, because then it's got ecological validity, right? Where you can say, hey, I'm not talking like some fancy stats lingo or anything here. I'm saying that those people really do reach the threshold that can show that they're being, they're seeing some benefits from this intervention. And then you're absolutely right that in a clinical context, it's a little bit easier to do, in the sense that it's clear what people are trying to do, right? If you're trying to, say, help people with a clinical disorder, for example, it's usually kind of, it's usually obvious what the target is, or what a good outcome might be. right? Whereas if you're looking at some kind of intervention to enhance, cognition in healthy individuals, well, it's kind of like it's unclear, right? Like things would need to generalize for it to be good, but to what extent? So it's all about, how you actually define this and how you think about that. So it's a little bit more fuzzy.
Yes, thank you so much. Because in healthy, it's a bit more difficult, especially when you said that not all outcome measures is designed to detect the improvement. So the saturation is always problems. It's challenging to find an appropriate outcome measures that fit to that experiments. Yes, it's very interesting. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
哎，
I think you.
我是麦克风没开。
I think your microphone is mute.
Sorry. So I just want to have a comment. Usually we use these neuropsychological measures to measure the healthy participants. We cannot observe any effect due to the Solon effect. So it's very, we have to be careful about how to select sensitive measures to review the intervention effect.
Yeah, you're right, and it's tricky because some measures are quite sensitive in a good way, as in they're going to pick up on improvements, more easily than others, and some measures seem sensitive, but actually it's just that they don't really have good retest reliability, right? So it's kind of it's sometimes not easy to differentiate between those two.
Right. So any other comments or questions?
Hi, David. Thank you for your talk. Well, I was really interested in the point that you made at the end about combining sort of different interventions. I think it makes sense to think that, that would do a better job at, improving cognitive outcomes, for example. I'm curious if that's something that you're looking at or you've done in your own work, especially because, with work on non-invasive brain stimulation, for example, I believe there's some research showing that, what you're doing while the stimulation is happening, like if you're doing, an NVAC task, can help, can affect the results compared to just not doing anything or doing, a different task. So yeah, I thought that was a really interesting point.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I think, it's true that there's been some research looking at combining things like TDCS and physical exercise. It's kind of like it's difficult because a lot of people have done slightly different things, and so it's kind of difficult to extract some. And with studies that are mostly those are intervention studies. Oftentimes, if you're going to have a combination of interventions, it's kind of difficult to reach good numbers in terms of the number of people that you get in there and have enough statistical power to make sure that those relationships are robust. But I think there's been some fairly good trials out there that have shown that some form of, say, cognitive stimulation with physical exercise is probably a good idea. I think this one is grounded in a lot of theory, actually, in the animal literature, where this all started with mice, research in mice that shown that combining, cognitive and physical stimulation was probably a good idea. And then it's been tried in humans in a lot of different ways with pretty good results. So I think that oftentimes, like in some of the work that I've done, we've tried to blend the two. So basically try and design some physical activity that is also very kind of like complicated, right? Cognitively stimulating, so that people have to actually kind of like think and move at the same time. So sports, in a way, they're kind of already like that, right? But the the first thing we do as we improve is trying to automate a lot of things to make it less cognitively challenging, right? So if I'm playing tennis or whatever, I'm just trying to work on my backhand a lot up until, a point where I don't have to think about it, and then I can focus on other things. So sports are good for that, but the way they're kind of designed, we have a tendency to, always kind of like get out of that phase and try to move on to the next phase where we don't have to think as much, at least not about the things that we used to think about. And so what we did try to do is, like, based on like some form of like wrestling, try to make sure that people are always, outside their comfort zone, so they always have to think about what it just did and kind of like mentally rotate those things and remember a sequence of movements and have to recall them, repeat them, all those kinds of things. And we did get some good results out of this, in the sense that people that were in that group, they did better than people who did either some form of brain training by itself or just physical exercise, say on a treadmill, or something more impoverished in a way, right? And so it does seem to be the case that combination of cognitive and physical stimulation is a good thing to have. But I do believe that at the end of the day, it's going to come down to being able to identify, being able to run large studies and identify within, for a particular person, what do they actually need, based on their profile. Because if someone is like really, say stressed, for example, or they might benefit a lot from meditation. If someone has a tendency to, there's been some meditation studies that have shown that for some people, not the majority, but for some of them, they actually do very poorly after meditation intervention, because they kind of, this inward thinking is not working for everyone, right? Some people just panic a lot as a result of that. And so, understanding individual differences, I think, is what it's going to come down to, just to be able to propose a plan that is not just, that plan that is the best for most people, but that is actually the best, say, for you in this case, right?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it is in line with the conceptual reality that, one thing is probably not going to work for everybody. So.
Yeah. And again, it's kind of like, just like what I said before about averages, it's kind of easy to say, right? And not as easy to address. And so, and we're aware of this. And if we had the kind of like the answer to those kind of things, I would present the answer rather than the challenge. But so that's like a space that we're working in at the moment. But yeah, it's definitely still work in progress.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for the question.
Any other questions from our students? If now, so we can end our talk here. So thank you very much. Thank you again.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much for having me.
We'd like to see you in Taiwan again.
Yeah.
Next time.
Hopefully soon.
Yeah.
That sounds good.
Yeah, we can play for some collaborations, because we have a very strong team to do the cognitive enhancement. So yeah, we can generate some research proposal and include you to run some studies.
Sounds great. All right. Perfect.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for the invitation. Yeah, that was great.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you. Goodbye.